So I'd like to talk today a little bit about Samson Raphael Hirsch. There are things to talk about him as an individual, as what I call somebody who has the ability not only to stand up against the tide, but to do it in a moderate way. You know, often people who oppose a trend which they think might be dangerous have a tendency to go to the opposite extreme, which is the easy way out. Because when you go to the opposite, at least people understand you're against it. But what if you think that the trend that you're opposing is partially right? What are you supposed to do? Hirsch believes that German Jewry is going through a difficult time. That's an understatement. Remember, it's just after the emancipation, and it's a time in which Jews have the right to be accepted under law, to be citizens of the country, even without being part of the Jewish community. So during this time, Jews want to do anything to be accepted. And as I said in last week's video, that very often assimilation among Jews, the propelling agent is the desire to be accepted, to live a normal life, to be part of society. And Germany, which sees emancipation early on, still has difficulty on the people level, on the, among the masses. So even though the country officially accepts Jews, but the masses have difficulties seeing Jews as their equal. It's not for no reason that later on in the century, by the 1880s, the term anti-Semitism is coined. So as Jews start embracing Protestantism in Germany, as they convert into Christianity in order to be accepted in society, the very fact that they are ethnically and racially Jewish becomes an issue by the end of the East century. So Hirsch can see this early on, where things are going. And so what's going to happen is he's going to oppose the reform movement's desire, and as I said last week, understandable desire. Remember, assimilation, mass assimilation starts the Jews in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, before the reform movement is founded in Hamburg, which is, by the way, the birthplace of Samson Raphael Hirsch. So reform movement in that sense was a response to try to stem the tide of Jews leaving en masse in waves out of the Jewish fold. However, yes, it's true that the reformers themselves were people of the time who were also influenced themselves by what was going on. First, Abraham Geiger. Geiger was more of a historical Jew, had a sense of history and tradition. In that sense, because of people like Geiger, reform in Germany and its was much more, I would say, moderate than what it becomes later on in the Pittsburgh Platform in the United States in 1885. But then you have even elements which are more radical in the reform movement, even in Germany. Remember, the first, you have these synods of the reform movement in Germany in 1840 and 1844 in Braunschweig. And in these various synods, you have these, the more traditionalists and the more radicalists, traditionalists like Geiger and others, radicalists like Samuel Holdheim, who pushes for the abolishment of things that are not conducive for participation in German society, like the idea of Zionism, the state of Israel. Well, of course, it wasn't the state of Israel at the time, but any mention of Zion and Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple, he thought that this was counterproductive to being accepted in German society. Things that Christians have difficulty understanding, like revival of the dead, Chiyat HaMeitim. Why should this be in our prayer book? It just makes things more complicated. So Holdheim is one of the early, even coming from a traditionalist family, is one of the early, what I would call more extreme responses of the reform movement already in 1844. So, but as I said, in a sense, despite the fact that this is has extreme elements in it, it is sort of understandable in the sense of this tidal wave of Jews who are leaving the fold in the first half of the 19th century. So in early reform, the changes are basically aesthetic. It's maybe taking Aramaic out of the Siddur, adding the organ. Doesn't have to be of course, they don't have electricity in those days, um, which is a problem on Shabbat, but let's say it's a rabbinic problem on Shabbat, if you want to put it that way. And other things which are done in the prayers just to make them a little bit more user friendly without any major changes. The rabbi wearing the garment, the robe of the Protestant minister, and preaching in German instead of Hebrew, or if they came from those areas, for Yiddish. And basically, so the first elements are aesthetic, and the later elements are already changes from within, which is, as I said, the patterns of Samuel Holdheim become the dominant pattern when the reform moves to the United States, because the early settlers, Jewish settlers in the United States in the 19th century, were German Jews who created institutions like B'nai B'rith, which exist still today, but also were those who brought the reform movement to the United States, and their 1885 platform was quite an extreme platform, which saw the ceremonial mitzvot of Judaism as something which was not pertinent for modern man at all. Neither kashrut nor Shabbat nor ways to follow the Chagim. They could be inspiring, but not anything which is binding on the modern Jew. So Hirsch basically grows up in this world. And I just want to mention a few things from Hirsch, from a very comprehensive article from the Encyclopedia Judaica. Hirsch is born in 1808 and dies in 1888 at the age of 80. Rabbi, writer, born in Hamburg, studies Talmud with his grandfather, Mendel Frankfurter. By the way, his father changed the family name from Frankfurter to Hirsch. His education was influenced by two of the enlightened Orthodox rabbis of the time, Jacob Ettlinger and Isaac Bernays. These are already rabbis who believed in the combination of what Hirsch was going to coin the term as Torah im derech eretz, which for him meant Torah with a livelihood. And a livelihood meant general education. So Hirsch was a big believer, not only in emancipation. Hirsch believed that emancipation, as opposed to the Eastern European rabbis, he believed that emancipation was good for the Jews, that the Jews should confront the modern world. But there's no problem with embracing modernity and at the same time holding on to your traditions. This was something very difficult for a 19th century Jew in Germany to understand, because they naturally understood it as to be accepted, we have to throw off the shackles of the ghetto. And the ghetto meant traditional Judaism. But Hirsch was able to see ahead and understand that eventually acceptance by betraying yourself is not something which will ever really happen. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say, that non-Jews like Jews who like Judaism. So, because everybody likes seeing somebody who's loyal to their tradition and tries to speak up for it, especially if it is an ancient tradition. So, by the way, anybody who's read The Chosen by Chaim Potok, famous novelist, about this Hasidic boy who becomes interested in general studies, and then he goes off to New York City to study in Hirsch College. And Hirsch College is referring to Yeshiva University, which again, its motto is Torah and Derech Eretz, which means Torah and secular knowledge. Even though Torah and Derech Eretz and Pirkei Avot is most probably referring to a livelihood, but Hirsch understood it as Torah with secular knowledge or general knowledge. And this is the motto of Yeshiva University, which was nicknamed in that book Hirsch College, and for very good reasons. So, and also he himself included secular studies in the curriculum of the Talmud Torah of that city, meaning Chacham Bernays. So Hirsch already had people, he had scholars who already believed in this concept of Torah with Derech Eretz, the concept that he promoted. Hirsch also attended the University of Bonn just for 1 year in 1829, where he studied classical languages, history, and philosophy. And interestingly enough, in that university, he met Abraham Geiger, which was later going to be his major opponent. But at that time, they hit it off. They were both interested in Jewish history. They were young Jews in the University of Bonn, and they were quite friendly. It's only after Hirsch published his famous Letters to Ben Uziel, which later was called the 19 Letters, and Abraham Geiger wrote a very strong criticism against the book, because by that time Geiger was on his own path, that the friendship broke between them. So, but that's also something interesting about. So, 1830, Hirsch becomes the Land Rabbiner of the Principality of Oldenburg. I think I mentioned, maybe not here, in other places, both Germany and France. France has its consistoire, which is funded by the government, which is an orderly rabbinate. England also has an orderly rabbinate, which runs the United Synagogue. And so in Germany, the government funded the Jewish community, and there had to be an orderly community, and therefore every region had its Land Rabbiner. So he becomes a Land Rabbiner of Oldenburg, where he's there for 11 years, and there he writes the 19 letters of Ben Uziel, which I will quote something from it in Altona in 1836. And as I mentioned, it was okay. Even though Geiger was critical of the 19 letters, the historian Gretz was deeply impressed by it, and impressed by Hirsch. He actually went to Oldenburg in 1837 and was there for 3 years to complete his Jewish education under Hirsch, under Samson Raphael Hirsch. I just want to mention a few things. 1841, Hirsch moves to Emden. He's there the rabbi of Aurich and Ostenbruck in Hanover. And 1846 till 51, he lives in Nikolsburg and becomes the Land Rabbiner of Moravia. Let's just skip a little bit. The extreme Orthodox community that he served, by the way, in Moravia, had reservations about the immediate position he adopted between Orthodox and Reform. You see, Hirsch, by nature, was not an extremist. And he thought that the best way to resolve conflict was by mediation and finding a middle road. So emancipation has gifts. Let's look at the benefits. Why should we just look at the negativity? The interface with modernity can bring us secular knowledge to enhance our understanding of Torah. Why look at it? Why not look at the benefits? Why look just at the negativity? But as you know, a lot of people, especially when they are reactionary in their psychology, because I've always said that an extremist position is a psychology more than it is an ideology. Remember that. So basically, a lot of people have difficulties. Here's a man who's representing Orthodox positions around the country, and he's not attacking the reform in the way that we would want him to. He's also mentioning some positive things about some of the people, which they're not very happy about. This is, of course, Hirsch at this point in his life. Some of the customs that he practiced, for instance, wearing the robe during the services, which is something the Reform was very big about, wearing the official robe, by the way, which was taken over by the conservative movement, especially it was taken over even before the conservative movement by the United Synagogue in England, which was the Orthodox. And I can tell you my father's synagogue in Montreal, Sha'ar HaShamayim, which to this day the rabbi wears the robe because of the English influence which was on The synagogue one was established in 1846, so which was yeah, which is of course before Canada becomes a country. So some of the customs that he practiced, wearing the robe during the services, and his method of teaching with argumentation, and his refusal to disregard the study of the Bible, because remember, there are a lot who were afraid of Bible criticism and therefore thought maybe yeshivot should not study Bible at all, aroused opposition among extreme Orthodox elements in Nikolsburg. So that's another thing which is interesting about Hirsch, because, as I said, it is not his nature to take a radical position. He is a man who is interfacing with the new world. He is a man who is open to modernity, open to the emancipation, interested in secular knowledge, spent a year in the university, befriended Geiger because at the beginning he didn't see the differences, the major differences between them, or maybe he did but overlooked them at the time. Yes. Now, as I said, Hirsch then uses the term of Rabbi Gamliel in the ethics of in Pirkei Avot, Torah derech eretz, meaning which normally is understood as an occupation, as meaning Torah with secular knowledge. And secular knowledge, of course, the language, German, mathematics, natural sciences, geography, history, etc. Now, I just want to quote a few things and then as I said, Hirsch becomes one of the main opponents of the reform movement in Germany. This does not happen quickly, because as I said, Hirsch's first tendency was live and let live, and let's see if we can do mediation. And this is mentioned very nicely here, Time. I want to mention it too. So basically, with all his opposition to the reform movement, Hirsch did not consider that there was sufficient ground for an organizational separation between Orthodox and Reform Judaism. I mean, why can't they meet together as leaders of the community? Even the rejection of the belief in the coming of the return to Zion in the prayers of the Hamburg Temple, the Reform Temple in Hamburg, which Hirsch strongly opposed, even that did not impel him to the idea of separating, in contradiction to Geiger, who regarded separation as a surgical operation, because Geiger felt that the only way the reform would make a statement is actually by separating itself from the Orthodox Jewish community. So when the Rabbinical Synod of Braunschweig, in 1844 decided to annul several prohibitions of the dietary laws of kashrut, marital laws, then Hirsch changed his attitude. In a letter addressed to Reform, Hirsch wrote that if they carried out their decisions, the house of Israel would split into two. So Hirsch finally takes his stand after 1844, hoping that there would have been some middle road, some understanding when the Reform movement starts pushing the idea of the split and takes actions against Jewish law. So Hirsch decides the time is ripe. As authority in the congregations increasingly passed, one other thing. The Reform wing, which would be the ones to disrupt the unity of the people. So he writes, our covenant of unity will no longer endure, and brother shall depart from brother in tears. As authority in the congregations increasingly passed to the hands of the supporters of the break, a breach between Orthodox and Reform became the slogan of Hirsch and his supporters. So people only remember that, but they don't remember how it actually came to be. Now, this is an interesting point which I want to elaborate upon. As an example, Hirsch pointed to the congregation in Hungary, where the government in 1871, after the Congress of the Hungarian Jewry in 1868, recognized the Orthodox congregations in a separate body. In a memorandum published in the writings, written by Hirsch, etc. So Hirsch gets the idea of the separated community, Kihila Nifredet in Hebrew, from Hungarian Jewry, who received this possibility from their government in 1871. The leader of Hungarian Jewry, of course, is Moshe Sofer, known as the Khatam Sofer, who, by the way, in his younger days spent time in Germany. So it's very possible that he knew of Hirsch, even if he never met him. And of course, Hirsch knew of the Khatam Sofer because of his famous name. And Khatam Sofer was the one who not only pushed to separate from the reform movement in every extreme fashion, but also Khatam Sofer is known for his slogan, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. All new things are suspicious from a Torah point of view, which of course is a misreading of, of a halacha, which refers to when you're allowed to eat the new grains of that year. It's called Chadash. But he's purposely misreading it to say Chadash refers to the new grains, but he's purposely misreading it to mean anything new, not just the new grains, is not allowed according to the Torah, meaning should be held under suspicion. And first and foremost, the Khatam Sofer was referring to the Reform movement, who believed in reforming Judaism, and every novelty was considered something good. So Hirsch, in a sense, simultaneously with the Hungarian Jewish community, creates the split community. Now, this split, you have to understand, it was accepted eventually by the German government, but the split, in a sense, is really quite severe, because there were those in the Orthodox Jewish community who believed in the unity of the Jewish community despite the differences in opinion. And those Orthodox communities remained together with the Reform. But the Hirschian influenced communities broke off even from the Orthodox communities who were willing to work together with the Reform. Just understand, this is the real separated community. So here we have our first ironical, iconic aspect of the persona of Hirsch from a Jewish historical point of view in the 19th century. Because Hirsch, as the one who coins the motto publicly, Torah im derech eretz, Torah with secular knowledge, as the man who embraces modernity and the emancipation, is on the one hand the father of what later is to be called in the 20th century modern Orthodoxy, especially in the United States. He's also going to be the forerunner of all those Western European rabbis who become rabbi doctors, which was very popular in Germany and France and England in the 20th century. And and he is going to be the inspiration of Yeshiva University, the rabbinical school of modern Orthodoxy in the United States today. But paradoxically, it is that same Hirsch who embraces the separate community, just like which happens in Hungary under the Khatam Sofer, which is the model of the Haredi community, who opposes modernity and opposes the reform, and because of that wants to live in insular communities, and they take their cue from the Khatam Sofer of the 19th century. And Hirsch follows very closely down the road right after them. So even though the modern Haredim would probably not take their cue from Hirsch and would not see Hirsch as their founder, but in a sense, ideologically, Hirsch becomes an example both for modern Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy simultaneously in Germany at the time. That's why it's not actually surprising that Orthodox German Jews who came to Israel after the founding of the state, many of them joined what was called in the early years of the state, Poalei Agudat Israel. Agudat Israel, which represented the ultra-Orthodox community politically in Israel. Today it's just called Agudat Israel, but for many years there was Agudat Israel, and they had their agricultural branch, their kibbutz branch, which was called Poalei Agudat Israel, their, you might say, Zionist activist branch. And because the Orthodox Jews from Germany, on the one hand, many of them being Hirschians, related more to the ultra-Orthodox and the idea of a separate community, but on the other hand, didn't really have a problem with Zionism, they felt more comfortable with Poalei Agudat Israel than they did with Agudat Israel. Like, for instance, in Jerusalem, the Yeshiva Chorev, which is both for men and women, elementary school and high school, which was the first yeshiva in Jerusalem to teach in Ivrit, to teach in modern Hebrew, Ashkenazic yeshiva, because it was found by German Jews. And it incorporated secular studies like the Hirschian idea. And it was maybe didn't start off as being majorly Zionist, but was sympathetic to Zionism. That's why later on, when it was taken over by more, let's say, religious Zionists, the transformation was not a major changeover from what they were before. It was basically going from Hirschian to religious Zionists, you might say, which was not a major step at the time. A few other things to say about Hirsch. Hirsch does recognize the importance of the land of Israel. But despite that, he is not a Zionist. Okay? He talks about the love of Zion, about Jewish national consciousness, but he is weary of the Herzlian Zionist movement and is not really sure that it's going to take anybody anywhere. Even Chibat Zion, he had some hesitations, Rabbi Kalisher and others. Okay, one other things maybe to say about Hirsch. Hirsch also understands the commandments. In his book Chorev, he understands the commandments, the ceremony. Of course, in his 19 letters to Uziel, he breaks up the commandments into different categories. I would say brilliantly, based on Tehillim chapter 19. But in general, Hirsch says that the commandments which are more ceremonial between God and man have symbolic meanings to them. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Kook, in his Orot HaKodesh, takes, I would say, basically takes issue with Hirsch, with the idea of seeing any of the mitzvot as just symbols. And Rabbi Kook says all the mitzvot have inherent properties and shouldn't be just understood as symbols. But for Hirsch, this was an important way of of seeing these things. I want to read you something from the Hirsch Chumash on this week's Parsha. So in the Hirsch Chumash on this week's Parsha, Parshat Va'era. No, I will start from the 19 letters. In the 19 letters, which is called Letters to Ben Uziel, Hirsch is really addressing the Jews of the post-Enlightenment era in Germany. And he understands exactly where they're coming from. So just want to read a little bit. Israel's material weakness, this is the 15th letter, which is called the answer. Israel's material weakness and poverty in worldly goods and pleasures seems to you as part of a scheme of God's revealing existence. You realize that the apparent humbleness of the nation's lot did not affect its mission or diminish its greatness. It simply exchanged one kind of greatness for another, and dispersion opened for it a new and broader fulfillment of its mission. Even in the diaspora, the Jews flourished. As for the law, is it really a break on all the joys of life? Is it a hindrance denying the gratification of the natural human cravings for pleasure? Do examine the precepts of the law from beginning to end. What legitimate desire does it forbid to gratify? What natural impulse would it actually destroy? The contrary, it ennobles and sanctifies our animal impulses by applying them with prudence to the purposes designed by God. Righteousness is the law's character. The gratification of the physical has never been a goal. And one other quote from Hirsch. Remember, what Jews wanted in Germany was acceptance by the non-Jewish society. And Hirsch writes, and what about our relationship with non-Jews? We make ourselves so conspicuous, you say. They know immediately that we are Jews. O son of this day and age, who tells you to deny or conceal the fact that you're a Jew? Be a Jew, really and truly so. Endeavor to attain to an ideal of true Jew and fulfillment of justice and righteousness and love. Then you will be respected, not in spite of the fact that you're a Jew, but because you are one. Conceive of yourself as a Jew. Disseminate that realization by word and deed among your non-Jewish brethren. You will leave no reason to complain that your Judaism cannot travel incognito. We cannot become truly intimate with them, truly friendly, if we do not at least eat and drink with them at their social gatherings. This is what you were saying. But again, I say to you, practice righteousness, love the Torah, be just in your deeds, truthful in your speech, with love in your heart for your non-Jewish brother as the law teaches you. Feed his hungry, clothe his naked, console his mourners, restore his sick, help his helpless, assist him with counsel and deed in the time of need and sorrow. Unfold the whole noble breadth of your Israeldom. Can you think that he will not respect you and love you? Or that there will not be a result as great a degree of social intimacy as your life can concede? Why don't you think he'll understand? If you practice the truths of Judaism, eventually the non-Jews will see it. If you hide it, they will think that you have something to hide. And one last quote from Hirsch, and that's it for today. In his very often inspiring, I would say, commentary on the Torah, and he talks about Va'era. And God spoke to Moses and said, I am God, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. But the name, the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, I did not make myself known to them. What does this mean? It says this is the new revelation of God, which was prepared from the very beginning of Jewish history. All its development led up to this moment. I was already Havaya, God, even before I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the name El Shaddai did not allow my intended rule to be apparent in their experiences of their lives. You are surprised, Moses, that until now things have become worse and worse? And even your having been sent until now is where you think of pushing misery on the whole situation? Look at Abraham and Jacob, the poor slaving servant who had to slave to get his first wife and slave for his second wife. I could equally well have led you up the upward path. Instead of letting Abraham get a son in his 100th year, I could have caused the family to be raised by him. And then they could have been 70 and allowed his descendants to go down to this nation of Egypt. But then that nation would have not been the people of God. They wouldn't have been Am Hashem, the nation that reveals God. The nation would be then no different than any other nation. It could have developed from ordinary causes just like them and stood on material, visible, firm ground with source of powers and greatness in material power and greatness just like them. And only aspired to spiritual and the moral as far as materialism left space for it. But in contrast to other nations, this nation will get its land and have a foundation solely in God, freely of its own will, carrying out God's will, and only to have material substance in its land from God with this aspiration. Remember that the idea of a free Almighty God and the resultant concept of mankind being free have been lost. That men and nations were theoretically and practically sunk into materialism, denying the pure conception of the complete freedom of will of man. By the entrance of the Abrahamic nation, the old idea will be reawakened, and mankind will be saved from depressing effects of materialism and the lack of true freedom of will. This is why the nation had to start where the other nations finished. Hirsch was not just a dreamer, but a doer. And really to this day, even if some of his reigns are a little antiquated, they still inspire people to this day. And luckily, we've had great men in our history. And Hirsch was the right man at the right time, holding the fort in a very difficult Jewish community and situation. Shalom, shalom.